Greetings, welcome back to Black Bear News, where we are discussing abrupt climate change. And if you find yourself getting unsubbed from my channel, just please resubscribe. I'm noticing a lot of people resubscribing over and over again. I'm sorry. That is a little YouTube trick, a little soft censorship by YouTube, is to, unsub people from channels randomly. And that's how it's just a little annoying form of control. So, yeah, that's what's happening. I apologize for that lameness, but I don't know what else to do about it. I have nothing to do with it. So we're just going to cover a few things tonight. Let me start with something. I didn't read this article, so I don't know where it's going to go or how it's going to end up. I know that people are feeling overwhelmed by the news of climate change, by the realities of climate change, by the grim possibilities, if you will. So this is, I think Robin sent me this, the best medicine for my climate grief. A climate scientist talks to a psychologist about coping with the crushing stress related to climate change. Here's what he learned. Sometimes a wave of climate grief breaks over me. It happens unexpectedly, perhaps during a book talk or while on the phone with a congressional representative. In a millisecond, without warning, I'll feel my throat clench, my eyes sting, and my stomach drop, as though the earth below me is falling away. During these moments, I feel with excruciating clarity everything that we're losing, but also connection and love for those things. Usually I don't mind the grief. It's clarifying, it makes sense to me, and inspires me to work harder than ever. Occasionally, however, I feel something quite different, a paralyzing sense of anxiety. This climate dread can last for days, even weeks. It can come with nightmares. For example, my favorite shady oak grove, baking in the full sun of a heat wave, the oaks all dead and gone. During these periods, writing about climate change becomes all but impossible, as if hundreds of thoughts are jostling to squeeze through a narrow doorway onto the page. My scientific output slows to a trickle as well. It feels like it just doesn't matter. I sense a social barrier to talking about these emotions. If I bring up climate change in casual conversation, the topic is often met with awkward pauses and the polite introduction of new subjects. Aside from increasingly frequent articles in the news about the typically incremental and sometimes disastrous progression of climate breakdown, we seldom talk about it face to face. It's as though the topic is impolite, even taboo. With so much at stake, our security and normalcy, the futures we'd envisioned for our children, our sense of progress and where we fit in the universe, beloved places, species, and ecosystems, the psychology is going to be complex. So I reached out to Renee Lertzman to gain insight into how we're coping with such huge impending losses. Lertzman is a psychologist studying the effects of environmental loss on mental health and the author of Environmental Melancholia, Psychoanalytic Dimensions of Engagement. There is overwhelming research that distress and anxiety related to climate is on the rise, she told me. Many people, I'd argue, are experiencing what I'd call a latent form of climate anxiety or dread, in that they may not be talking about it much, but they are feeling it. If we're feeling these emotions, or if we know others who are, it would be helpful to talk about them. The main thing is that we find ways to talk about what we are experiencing in a safe and non-judgmental context, and to be open to listening. All too often, when anxiety or fear comes up, we all want to push it away, move into solutions. A 2017 report by the American Psychological Association found that climate change is causing stress, anxiety, depression, and relationship strain. The psychological weight of climate change can lead to feelings of helplessness and fear, and to climate disengagement. Not surprisingly, those directly impacted by climate-augmented disasters fare even worse. For example, after Hurricane Katrina, suicide in affected areas more than doubled. The situation in post-Maria Puerto Rico is similarly dire. In general, suicide is projected to rise dramatically due to climate change. In addition to the psychological toll, our brains don't respond well physically to excessive heat. To think daily about climate change and any of its dire implications can be a crushing psychological burden. Each of us is just one mammal with all our mammalian limitations. We get tired, sad, irritated, sick, overwhelmed, and the climate crisis wields the force of 8 billion humans with infrastructure, corporations, capital, politics, and imaginations heavily invested in burning fossil fuel. It's important to remember that inaction is rarely about a lack of concern or care, but is so much more complex. Lertzman said, namely that we Westerners are living in a society that is still deeply entrenched in the very practices we know that are damaging and destructive. This creates a very specific kind of situation, what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. Unless we know how to work with this dissonance, we will continue to come up against resistance, inaction, and reactivity. I've been working through my own climate dissonance since 2006, back when the atmospheric carbon concentration was just 380 parts per million. That year, I reached a tipping point in my own awareness of what was happening and what it meant. It was challenging to carry that knowledge when no one else close to me seemed to care. But said Lertzman, we need to be careful not to make assumptions about other people's relationships with these issues. Even if people may not be showing it, research shows again and again that it's still on their minds and a source of discomfort or distress. If she's right, maybe the sea change and public action we desperately need is closer than it seems. It would certainly be helpful if we could talk openly about how climate change is making us feel. Things do feel somewhat different now, both because more people are calling for action than in 2006, and also because I'm now part of communities with people who are as concerned as I am. For example, my local chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby, there are more people in my life talking openly about climate change, and that helps. Another way I cope is by simply burning less fossil fuel. This eliminates internal cognitive dissonance by aligning my actions with my knowledge. It also brings some great fringe benefits, such as more exercise from biking, healthier eating through vegetarianism, more connection to the land through gardening, and more connection to my community through activism and public outreach. Finally, I've actively worked to be hope-oriented. In the film Melancholia, about a mysterious planet on a collision course with Earth, the protagonist passively accepts, even embraces apocalypse. Nothing can stop it. Ecological annihilation is inevitable. Modern climate change is completely different. It's 100% human caused, so it's 100% human solvable. If humans pull together as if our lives depended on it, and that's a whole lot of if. We could leave fossil fuel in a matter of years. This would require radical change across global society, and I'm not suggesting it will happen, but it could. And this possibility leaves open a middle path, something between sweeping climate action and an unavoidable planetary collision, a rapid cultural shift, one that we all can contribute to through our conversations and our daily actions, and that's a very hopeful thing. All right. That ended on a whole big glass of hopium. But hey, that's all right. Some people like to drink the hopium, some people do not. I don't know. I don't know what to say about the hopium part. I mean, you know, everything else is what it is. it's, you know, I think it's one of those, you know, I survive by just being too busy to think about it. And I think that, um, I think I have a bit of workaholic in my bloodstream. And so, I'm just constantly, you know, got projects on my brain and, activities and whatnot. And so, and I've just got so much going, you know, so many crushing crises in my life that I'm just, you know, I can't think about climate. I don't have a lot of spare time to think about climate change. When I do, it is pretty overwhelming. And that's why I do these videos, because instead of being bottled up and pissed off and wanting to stand in my front yard and shout at the top of my lungs, I'll just, you know, I can come do these videos, and you know, I don't know if it makes it better or worse. I'm not sure. I don't know if these, you know, I assume these videos are helping people. I'm not sure sometimes. But reach out if you are feeling overwhelmed. By all means, reach out to people around you. Reach out to somebody who can understand what you're going through, because you know, in the same sense as, you know, as any other affliction, alcoholism or cancer or overeating or you know, narcissistic abuse or whatever it is that you are going through in your life, like the best thing you can do is not feel alone in your struggle, right? You need others around you who are struggling with the same issues, and that can alleviate a lot of burden and can lead to possible, you know, some healthier thinking about it. Moving on, I'm going to quickly dip into something from Faster Than Expected. And this actually kind of coincides with, I don't know, somebody suggested that I watch a documentary called The Age of Stupid in the comments a couple of days ago, and I watched it, and it's great. So if you're, you know, obviously all of you are on YouTube, just type in The Age of Stupid, and it's right there. You can watch the whole thing, and it's quite a good film if you haven't already seen it. But they do talk to somebody who's talking about the Alps melting in that movie. Climate change is melting the French Alps, say mountaineers. This is from August 24th from The Guardian. Global climate change has serious and directly observable consequences in high mountains, says Vincent Neerink from Mountain Wilderness, a campaign group that works to preserve mountain environments around the world. One of the consequences of climate change is the ongoing retreat of glaciers. In the Alps, the glacier surfaces have shrunk by half between 1900 and 2012, with a strong acceleration of the melting processes since the 1980s, says Jacques Moret, a climber and scientist who is researching the impact of climate change on the mountains above Chamonix. Another key impact of climate change in the mountains is that it is leading to an increase in the number of rock falls. More than 550 occurred in the Mont Blanc Massif alone between 2007 and 2015. The reason, explains Murray, is that the permafrost that lies within cracks of rocks and cements them together is now melting. As the permafrost melts, the whole sections of rock become destabilized and more prone to collapse. That is what has caused the destruction of the iconic Bonatti Pillar, a massive column of rock and popular climbing spot that collapsed in the scorching hot summer of 2005. Significantly, climate change is happening almost twice as fast in high mountains as compared to the rest of the planet. Did I already read this? I feel like I did. Or some parts of it. It's hard because I read so many things, and sometimes I read articles and I don't read them on the show. and I'll read them, and then I'm confused as to whether I actually read them out loud or not. But that's the end for that little clip. So I'm going to move on to this from the Huffington Post. Feeling sick, you may have a case of climate change. Climate change is quite literally making us ill. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reported that this spring that diseases from mosquito, flea, and tick bites tripled in the U.S. between 2004 and 2016, with more than 640,000 cases seen during that period of time. Maine alone saw a 20-fold increase in cases of tick-borne illness, the tick-borne illness Lyme disease. The danger showed no sign of abating this year, with ticks crawling into Mainers' lives as early as May. Their premature arrival was largely a product of warmer temperatures in the region, temperatures that reflect the broader trend of global climate change. It is perhaps for this reason that Lyme disease, once a regional problem largely confined to New England, has now been detected in all 50 states. Warm weather-loving ticks and the Lyme disease they bring with them is just one example of how our rapidly heating planet is undermining our health. It operates much like a disease. Climate change's symptoms include storms and fires, fever and smoke, and the mental and physical health challenges that characterize the long aftermath of disasters. It is through these hazards that climate change has gotten under our skin, into our lungs, and weighed on our minds in the detriment of our well-being, to the detriment. It's not hard to imagine how we'd respond if any other disease created all this havoc. We'd work to find the cause of the disease so we could develop a vaccine as soon as possible. Climate change's most visible symptoms are the natural disasters we've seen so often in recent years. Shifting weather patterns caused by rising global temperatures have significantly increased the occurrence of such events, from hurricanes to floods to wildfires. According to the United Nations Refugee Agency, the worldwide number of reported natural disasters has doubled in the last 20 years. When a disaster strikes, the most immediate threat to health is, of course, the danger posed by the event itself. During the devastating 2017 wildfires in California and Oregon, for example, many living near the smoke reported respiratory distress and other health complications from breathing the dangerous fumes. But this initial hazard is often just a prologue to the damage these disasters can have on our health, damage that unfolds over the course of weeks, months, or even years. Take standing floodwater, for example. It's a ripe breeding ground for mosquitoes and bacteria and can pose a serious threat in the period following a major storm. Climate change's impact is combined with the destruction of basic infrastructure like power grids and drinking water delivery systems, and the loss of core services like healthcare and waste disposal. It can both create new health challenges and complicate the treatment of existing ones. As the threat to our physical health lingers after a disaster, so too can the threat to our mental health. As many as 30 to 60% of adult disaster victims experience the effects of post-traumatic stress disorder. Affected populations are also at risk of depression and the substance abuse that they might initially turn to as a coping strategy. While each person's capacity for resilience is, of course, different, the mental and physical scars of disasters have the potential to last a lifetime. Those who stand in the way of addressing climate change in 2018 have declared themselves friends of disease and foes of health. A subtler symptom of climate change is its effect on the transmission of infectious diseases. In epidemiology, anything that transmits an infectious disease from one organism to another is known as a disease vector. A tick is an example of a disease vector. Beyond Lyme disease, climatic conditions also affect the spread of diseases like malaria, dengue fever, Zika, and yellow fever. By shaping the life and migration of a common disease vector, the mosquito. The primary vector of dengue fever, for example, is the Aedes genus of mosquito, or Aedes. Whether or not this mosquito can live and breed in a given area largely depends on the temperature, precipitation, humidity, and vapor pressure in the region. Climate change has the potential to broaden the range of where this disease can thrive, and it appears to already be doing so. Over the last 50 years, the incidence of dengue has increased 30-fold. The disease is now poised to spread among low and middle income countries where health systems are ill-equipped to shoulder this increased burden. We're facing a global pandemic whose symptoms include polluted air, flooded streets, burning forests, the destruction of cities and towns, injury, death, depression, PTSD, that's PTSD, substance abuse, and legions of blood-sucking disease-carrying insects. It's not hard to imagine how we'd respond if any other disease created all this havoc. We'd work to find the cause of the disease so we could develop a vaccine as soon as possible, but time and again we fail to take this step when it comes to climate change. This is especially inexcusable considering we already know the main cause of the illness, global CO2 emissions. But rather than address this cause head on, we've wasted valuable time while one of America's two major political parties largely refuses to acknowledge the problem even exists, much less act to solve it by cutting back on emissions and investing in renewable energy. Last January, climate change symptoms include storms, fires, fever, and smoke, the mental and physical health challenges that characterize the long aftermath of disasters. Last January, for example, Paul LePage, the Republican governor of Maine, issued an executive order placing a moratorium on the development of new wind power in the state. In taking this action just a few months before the ticks began, their early approach, LePage chose to ignore the evidence before him and gamble with the health of his constituents. This echoed the action of President Donald Trump, whose decision to withdraw from the U.S. from the Paris Climate Agreement last year was, as far as health is concerned, equivalent to denying a city stricken with plague access to a supply of life-saving cure. The one difference is that Trump's move has the potential to cause misery and death on a far larger scale. And this is no overstatement. Given all we know about global warming, what causes it, what we can do about it, and the necessity of speed in heading off its worst effects, those who stand in the way of addressing climate change in 2018 have declared themselves friends of disease and foes of health. We cannot afford to wait for them to act any more than a doctor can afford to dally when a patient lies critically ill before her. We must collectively fight the disease of climate change before the symptoms worsen. We do, and we must. I think I'm going to finish up with this article here from Axios. Despite renewables growth, there has never been an energy transition. And I don't know if I got the whole thing, so maybe I need to get this. Despite renewables growth, there has never been an energy transition. Since 2010, the costs of producing electricity from solar photovoltaic systems have decreased by more than 80%. Wind and solar now vie with natural gas to provide new electricity generating capacity. To some, these trends signal the world's latest energy transition away from fossil fuels and toward a renewable future. The big picture, these historical changes in the energy system, however, have been a matter of addition, not transition. Although the percentage shares of biomass, coal, and oil in our energy supply have fallen with the rise of alternatives, their total use continues to grow. The world has never experienced an energy transition, but the challenge of climate change means that for the first time, one will need to begin. Since 1800, biomass consumption has increased by about 275%, and coal use by more than 60% just since the year 2000. Rapidly falling costs and growing investments have helped to boost wind and solar power, but these energy sources like nuclear, oil, and gas before them are building on top of old ones rather than replacing them. A true energy transition will need to reduce carbon emissions by 2040. The International Energy Agency projects that to reach the climate targets laid out in the Paris Agreement, global coal consumption would need to decline by more than half, while oil consumption falls by almost 25%. Natural gas could continue to grow, though more slowly than today. Renewables would need to increase roughly tenfold from today's levels to provide, together with nuclear or not, more than 25% of global energy. Economists have consistently identified the policies to achieve such a transition. A price on greenhouse gas emissions, coupled with incentives for early-stage research and new technology development, including advanced solar, nuclear, and carbon capture techniques. Yes, but while some major emitters are adopting these policies, they're mostly falling short of the goals outlined in Paris. And new investments in fossil fuels continue to more than double those in renewables. Meanwhile, federal policy in the U.S. is moving in the opposite direction, and even with ideal policies, a real energy transition would mean winners and losers, creating substantial challenges for regions reliant on the production, transformation, and consumption of fossil fuels. The bottom line, to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, renewables and new technologies will need to do more than build atop CO2-intensive fossil fuels. They will need to push out incumbents while at the same time expanding global energy access and reducing the system's environmental footprint. I mean, you know, it's great in theory. Looks good on paper. The chances of that happening are really, really small, unless people start showing some will. I just don't see the will. One moment. Following that article, I'm going to read one more. Try to push in one more article. This is from International Business Times, and I believe Cash linked this in the comments. Climate change study finds last fossil fuel car must be sold by 2035 to meet temperature goals. Let's read on. Transportation is responsible for 14% of the world's greenhouse gas emission. And a new study has found that in order to reach global warming goals set by world leaders last year, the last fossil fuel car would have to be sold by 2035. Is there a date on this? This is from 2016. The report, which has been backed up by 3 European research groups, spotlights the importance of transitioning to clean electric cars. Last December, world leaders met in Paris to discuss the climate and rising temperature. Collectively, members attending the summit set a goal to limit rising temperatures to well below 2 degrees Celsius above temperature. During the pre-industrial era, we calculate that the last gasoline diesel car will have to be sold by roughly 2035, the CAT report said, adding that it assumes fuel-based vehicles will be on the road until 2050. The findings of this report are significant, as most car makers do not intend to phase out gasoline-powered vehicles by 2035. Of course they don't. Toyota, for example, intends to reduce emissions by 90% by 2050. It's striking that it's so early. It means a huge change in the whole automobile industry. New Climate Institute's Nicholas Hone told Reuters. Already many experts are concerned that reaching the more ambitious goal, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, is near impossible. Reaching this goal would require swift action and sophisticated technology that can efficiently capture carbon. Electric vehicles are still more expensive to purchase than other cars, and policy projections still only see a share of around 5% of electric vehicles in the total European Union, China, and US fleets by 2030. According to US Environmental Protection Agency, transportation accounted for 26% of greenhouse gas emissions in 2014. Greenhouse gas emissions from transportation primarily come from burning fossil fuel for our cars, trucks, ships, trains, and planes, writes the EPA. Over 90% of the fuel used for transportation is petroleum-based, which includes gasoline and diesel. Yeah. The transition is happening really slowly, and you know, I just continue to see gigantic, incredibly huge, gigantic Escalades and four-wheel drives and big ass pickup trucks, and you know, just huge cars just rolling out brand new. You're going to have to pry those vehicles from people's cold dead bodies or cold dead hands, because they're going to be like, no, we're Americans, we're you know, I mean, you're going to have to pry the four-wheel drives and the hamburgers and the steak, the sirloin steaks and the Chick-fil-A's out of people's cold dead hands. Yeah. And meanwhile, everybody's like, you know, everybody in on the right, and many people are like, carbon tax? How dare you talk about a carbon tax? They can't tax me for wanting to live, be free, and buy my things. How dare you? We need an absolute, like, we need a new information regime. Before any of that can happen, we actually need to figure out a way to deprogram and de-brainwash people from the idea that they deserve all this stuff. You know, that you go out and you work hard, and you know, this is what you get. That absolutely needs to happen before any of this can happen. And I don't know how we're going to be able to do that in you know, a couple of weeks or whatever it is time we have left to make a change. I'm joking, of course, but you know, time is of the essence. So I just don't see reprogramming an entire race of an entire species of animal called humans that quickly. But who knows? Who knows? Maybe some diamond-like idea will, you know, come forth out of the heavens and land on Earth, and you know, spread like a sonic blast through all of civilization, and everybody will stop and look stunned at the sky and go, oh, okay, I guess we'll need to do something different now. Who knows? That's all I have for you tonight. Thank you so much for your eyes, your ears, and your conscience. If you would like to support this channel, you can do so at the links below. Until the next video, peace.